Alayna Hardy was a young woman full of dreams, ready to conquer New York City. From a close-knit family in Arizona to an exciting new life in Harlem, she seemed to have everything ahead of her. But behind the smiles and new beginnings, something dark was brewing. As her relationship with Fernando Munera grew, so did the danger. What started as a simple neighborly connection turned into something far more terrifying. Stay with me to uncover the surprising details of Alayna's story and the shocking events that led to her tragic fate. Alayna Catherine Hardy Crandall was born on May 14, 1994 in Santan Valley. Santan Valley is an unincorporated community located in the state of Arizona, United States, with a population of just over 100,000 people. Alayna grew up in a loving and close-knit family composed of her father, Lauren Hardy, her mother, Anitra Crandall, and her siblings. She spent most of her childhood and teenage years in her hometown, where she graduated high school in 2012 from Santan Foothills High School. At school, she was described as a dedicated and determined student. After graduating, Alayna decided to leave Santan Valley and move to New York City to pursue her dream of attending college to study nursing. This likely occurred in 2015, and she lived in 2 different neighborhoods in New York. In August 2020, she moved into an apartment on the top floor of a 4-story building located in Harlem, on the west side of New York City. According to her family, Alayna was very happy. She had always wanted to live in a big city. She loved life in New York, finding almost everything about the city appealing. The culture, art, and gastronomy were among the things Alayna enjoyed the most. Madison Elder, a cousin very close to Alayna, described her as an outgoing, cheerful, and energetic young woman. Madison said Alayna was someone who made friends easily and was very excited about her new life. On the first floor of the same building where Alayna had moved, there lived a 25-year-old man named Fernando Munera. Since Alayna had a knack for making friends, she got to know most of her neighbors, including Fernando. What started as a simple neighborly relationship eventually turned into something more, and at some point that same year, the two began dating. Although they continued living in separate apartments within the same building, they spent a lot of time together, mostly in Alayna's apartment. At first, their relationship was good, but after a while it became unstable and turbulent. According to testimonies from neighbors and Alayna's friends, Fernando was very controlling and even became violent toward her. Despite becoming a couple, the two were completely different individuals. Alayna was friendly, outgoing, and loved meeting new people. She was often surrounded by friends. Fernando, on the other hand, was described as somewhat quiet but extremely possessive. Reports indicate that the couple was together for about 8 months, but Fernando's controlling behavior emerged within the first few months. He disliked Alayna talking to certain friends and didn't want her going to certain places when invited by her friends. He also responded to some of Alayna's friends' messages on her phone without her permission. In these cases, without Alayna knowing, he would take her phone, and when he saw messages inviting her to go out, he would reply, pretending to be her, and decline the invitation. In addition, Fernando exhibited dangerous behavior. He often mixed medications with alcohol and rode his motorcycle at high speeds under the influence of these substances. He even had an accident, though it wasn't serious. As the months went by, arguments and fights between the couple became increasingly frequent. They would break up and then reconcile in a seemingly endless cycle. With each reconciliation, things seemed to get worse, with the fights and arguments escalating. During this time, the police were called to Alayna's apartment 6 times in response to domestic violence incidents. It was more than clear that things between the couple were out of control, and it was only a matter of time before something very bad happened. The critical turning point of this situation occurred on May 13, 2021. On that day, Alayna and Fernando were in her apartment and had a heated argument. Fernando, who was extremely agitated, grabbed Alayna forcefully and locked himself in the apartment with her, taking her phone away so she couldn't call for help. In his rage, Fernando began destroying everything in sight in the apartment. He broke doors, numerous items including electronics, and hurled glass bottles at the walls. While Fernando was busy smashing things in the apartment, Alayna took the opportunity to escape. She managed to get help and called 911, which dispatched several police officers to the building. Fernando was arrested and charged with unlawful imprisonment, property damage, assault, and second-degree harassment. Everyone believed that given his history, Fernando would remain in custody for some time, at least a few months. After all, the police had already been called to Alayna's apartment 6 times. However, the judge handling the case did not consider Fernando to be a threat, and as a result, he was released. Following this, a temporary restraining order was issued against Fernando, prohibiting him from approaching Alayna. Yet, he never respected this measure. Alayna completely distanced herself from Fernando, cutting off all contact with him. However, since they lived in the same building, it was challenging for her to maintain that distance. On several occasions, when Alayna arrived at the building, Fernando would sit on the stairs waiting for her, just to provoke her. Additionally, he sent hundreds of messages and called her repeatedly to tell her he was watching her. He criticized the way she dressed and sometimes demanded that she go home to change her clothes. At other times, he emotionally manipulated her in an attempt to get closer. But when that didn't work, he became even angrier. A week before the tragic day, Fernando made over 80 phone calls to Alayna. It didn't matter if she ignored him. He kept insisting on contacting her. According to her family, Alayna was very happy because that same week she had passed an exam to become a nursing assistant. She was also just a few months away from completing her long-awaited degree. On May 19, 2021, after persistent attempts, Fernando managed to convince Alayna to let him come to her apartment to talk. What was supposed to be just a conversation quickly escalated into a heated argument. As a result, Alayna decided to throw Fernando out. At first, he seemed to leave without any resistance. However, a few hours later, around 8:05 p.m., Fernando returned to Alayna's apartment and attempted to break down the door to force his way inside. At that moment, a desperate Alayna called the police, who quickly headed to the scene. By the time the officers arrived at 8:15 p.m., Fernando had already fled. He had jumped over a fence at the back of the building and then rode away on his motorcycle in an unknown direction. Despite Alayna's evident fear, the officers merely documented the complaint and left without searching for Fernando or issuing an alert to other patrols in the area to apprehend him. It's important to note that the temporary restraining order was still in effect, meaning Fernando should have been considered a fugitive for violating it. The New York Police Department later stated that the officers had filed both a complaint report and a domestic incident report, as Fernando was no longer present when they arrived. About 30 minutes later, at 8:45 p.m., the police received another call concerning the same building. This time, the call came from neighbors who reported hearing desperate screams coming from Alayna's apartment. When the officers returned to the scene, they found Alayna gravely injured. The woman was found covered in blood, lying on the ground outside her apartment. She had suffered 7 stab wounds, primarily in the neck area, and had numerous bite marks on her body. Alayna was rushed to Metropolitan Hospital in an ambulance, but tragically she passed away on the way there. Fernando was also found at the scene, suffering from severe knife wounds. These injuries were inflicted by Alayna in a desperate attempt to defend herself. Fernando was taken to the hospital in critical condition, but eventually recovered. After his recovery, he was arrested and charged with multiple crimes, including the murder of Alayna. According to the investigation, Fernando gained access to Alayna's apartment and caught her by surprise by climbing the fire escape and entering through an open window. He was armed with an air pistol and a knife. Consumed by rage and obsession, Fernando ambushed Alayna and attacked her. He inflicted 7 stab wounds on her, most of them in the neck, and bit her in several places on her body. Despite the immense fear and pain, Alayna did not make it easy for Fernando. She fought with all her strength and managed to grab the knife, stabbing Fernando in the chest. Unfortunately, her courageous effort was not enough to save her from Fernando's violence. Desperate and gravely wounded, Alayna, in a final act of courage, managed to escape her apartment. But Fernando was relentless. He pursued her down the building's hallway, covered in blood and still clutching the knife. Alayna's screams echoed through the corridors, alarming neighbors who, horrified, called the police. And the rest of the story is what you now know. Alayna's family was devastated when they learned what had happened. They struggled to comprehend the brutal way in which their beloved daughter was taken from them. Lauren Hardy, Alayna's father, said he had tried desperately to get his daughter out of the toxic and dangerous relationship with Fernando. He shared that he had many conversations with Alayna, urging her to cut all ties and distance herself from Fernando completely. Lauren described Fernando as a crazy, jealous psychopath who manipulated his daughter, an inherently kind person, into a destructive relationship. Madison Elder, Alayna's cousin, characterized Fernando as extremely controlling and possessive. She stated that he forced Alayna to distance herself from friends and tried to isolate her in order to dominate every aspect of her life. A friend of Fernando mentioned noticing a sudden and unsettling shift in his personality. According to this friend, Fernando always seemed impatient and irritable. The director of a domestic violence support center in New York City strongly criticized the police's actions in this case. She stated that there was no justification or reasonable explanation for the officers leaving Alayna alone and vulnerable without thoroughly investigating the situation. The director asserted that the police should have stayed with Alayna for at least an hour after the reported incident. They should have actively searched for Fernando until locating him and assessed the level of danger Alayna was facing at that moment. This failure, according to the director, reflected a lack of commitment to protecting the victim from her abuser. She labeled the New York Police Department's response as extremely inadequate. The director further criticized that the officers were neither prepared nor properly trained to handle such a severe case, which ultimately led to the loss of a young woman's life. Following the tragedy, Lauren Hardy, Alayna's father, launched a GoFundMe campaign to raise funds for transporting Alayna's body from New York to Arizona and covering funeral expenses. The campaign raised a total of $21,500. Alayna Hardy's funeral took place on June 19, 2021. She was buried at Gilbert Memorial Park Cemetery in a ceremony attended by dozens of people, including family, friends, and college classmates. On May 14, 2024, Fernando was found guilty of second-degree murder, first-degree robbery, second-degree robbery, and attempted first-degree crime. On June 20, 2024, the Manhattan District Attorney announced that Fernando Munera, then 29 years old, was sentenced to 40 years in prison. With this sentence, he will not be eligible for release until 2061, by which time he will be approximately 66 years old. Alayna's story is not just about her life, but also a call to attention about the need to improve authorities' responses to threats of violence so no other family has to suffer such a devastating loss.